Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tom Rack, a partner here at Withum, and I will be the moderator for today's presentation. As you know by now, recently Governor Murphy signed into law the Adult Use Cannabis Reform Bill, which simplistically legalized marijuana or cannabis for those 21 years or older. That same law also addresses possession by those younger than 21 and some related topics. The passage of this law raises many questions and concerns that business owners and others will need to address. I'm proud to introduce to you our panel for today's presentation. The first panelist is Fruquan Muzan. Fruquan is of counsel to the law firm of McElroy, Deutsch, Mulvaney & Carpenter and is the chair of their cannabis practice group. Prior to his current position, Fruquan served 4 years as general counsel to the New Jersey State Majority Office and was instrumental in the drafting of what would become New Jersey's law. The second panelist is a gentleman by the name of Dan Smith. Dan is a member of 1868 Public Affairs, a lobbying firm located in Trenton, New Jersey. Dan worked with the state legislature as a senior advisor to the Speaker of the General Assembly, and Dan was key in drafting of the New Jersey Cannabis Regulatory Enforcement Assistance and Marketplace Modernization Act. Dan is a member of the Executive Committee of the Mercer County Democratic Committee. Third, joining us today is Ryan Brandt Cpa. Ryan is a senior tax manager at Withum, where he devotes much of his time to compliance matters for corporations and pass-through entities. Ryan's clients include medicinal and fully vertical recreational cannabis clients. His clients include those in New Jersey, as well as some West Coast clients where recreational cannabis has been legal for some time. And finally, we have Sean Lindy. Sean is a manager at Withum in the audit department. Sean has experience in manufacturing, distribution, life science, and as you guessed, cannabis. He's a frequent lecturer at various workshops and conferences on emerging accounting topics. Before we begin, I have a few notes. At the bottom of the toolbar, you will see a chat box. Please feel free to send us your questions during the presentation, and we will do our best to address them at the end. Next, once the webinar is over, there will be a pop-up asking you to complete a survey of today's webinar. We do ask that you take a moment to complete it. It's our way of being able to provide you with the most relevant programming possible. And with that, let's begin with the questions. And the first question is going to be directed at the group. Folks, what are the next steps for the state of New Jersey in relation to cannabis, license applications, medicinals, first to market? What do we have, folks?
Well, I'll jump in. Currently, the Cannabis Regulatory Commission has been seated, 5 members. There is some talk in back rooms that there may be a couple members added. The NAACP has been vocal that they weren't happy that there were no African-American males on the panel. So that may change in the next few weeks. After that, I'm expecting an announcement of the 2019 winners that was held up in court for the last year and change. That has finally been released. So I'm expecting to find out who those winners were. Regulations are due to be done within 6 months of the bills being signed. So that would make it August 2021. And I'm hearing that maybe they may try to actually do it before 6 months is over. And then once that's happened, we can start seeing some recreational sales by the medical facilities if they're able to say they can serve all their patients. And then after that, applications for new license holders and new licenses. And this time next year, hopefully there will be many more dispensary options for customers.
Now, Fruquan, there was talk that everything was supposed to be in place by, I believe it was August 21st in terms of the commission. Does that deadline still look like it's going to be met, or are you hearing anything about potential delays in that?
No, I think it's going to be met, if not exceeded. Like, I think they were active in trying to get the regulations done even before. So after November happened, we knew that we were going to have to do some regulations. There are already medical regulations. So there's a 6-month window, but I'm hoping they get it done in 4. So August, July, I'm expecting.
And is there anything you think folks should be doing now in light of the fact that there's this window in place before everything becomes more finalized, if you will?
I think people that want to get in the industry should be working now to get their teams together, to get an accountant, to get business plans together, to start looking at locations, the whole nine. Because I tell clients that call me now, I'm like, first of all, there were 200 applications submitted back in 2019. Of those 200, 140 are going to be denied. So that's 140 people that have their applications ready to submit, and they're already ahead of you. So you need to be trying to catch up to them.
Right.
Yeah.
Anyone else like to jump in on this?
Yeah, sure, Tom. I'll just add that right now in New Jersey, also municipalities, right? What the bill included was that any municipality ordinances that prohibited cannabis companies were essentially made obsolete. Now they have, I believe, a 6-month window to vote again whether that municipality wants to accept or prohibit cannabis companies. So we're seeing many municipalities beginning to have those discussions now. And then one other item, in addition to the cannabis plant touching companies directly, is there's a lot of ancillary opportunities. So while yes, they're not going to be looking at the application process the same way that a direct cannabis touching company would be, ancillary companies need to have their ears open now to see what the interests are from companies, from consumers, and how they can get into the market early.
Okay. Dan, Ryan?
No, I think that pretty much covers it in terms of from a local standpoint, from municipalities, in terms of what the state's looking at. What I'd also say is, what happens with next steps is employers trying to figure out, from an employer-employee relationship, what's going to happen with the enforcement of cannabis with drug testing policies. I think that that's something that, is written into the law, but I do know that the New Jersey State Legislature is currently working on some cleanup legislation to address that as well.
Understood. Thanks. So, Fruquan, let me ask you this. Given the restricted number of licenses that are available, what do you think the best opportunities are for small and medium-sized companies that want to participate in the cannabis industry in New Jersey? And I know there's been some mention of micro licenses. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, I think the best opportunity, it depends on who you are, right? If you've been a pharmacist for 20 years, maybe you should look at a dispensary. If you've been a farmer for 20 years, maybe you should look at cultivation. Rocket scientists get a lab, and start testing. So there are certainly skill sets that lend themselves to certain industry, sections of the industry. And I think despite everything you may have heard, I think it's going to matter who you were before you tried to get a license when people are looking at your application. I think they're going to look at it like you would look at any other resume. Who are you? What have you done? And how does it lend itself to success in this next thing you're trying to do? If you don't have any particular skills, I think micro license may be a way to go. As you mentioned, those are for smaller companies, 10 or less employees. They're going to limit the size of the space you can use, how much money you can make right away. They are limiting the number of full-size cultivators to 37, and that's including the ones that already exist. So that's going to be tough. So micro licenses may be a way to get in. And I think the state is going to be looking to give a lot of those, especially with cultivation, to close any possible supply gap that may exist. Now, it may sound easy, but it's harder than it sounds when you start actually trying to do it, because to have a micro license, you have to be 100% New Jersey owned. So that means no one from out of state can be a part of it. And the people that are out of state are the ones with all the experience in the cannabis industry. So it kind of creates an issue where you have to be 100% owned, but you want to show some experience. And then 51% of the ownership has to be in the town where you want to open your facility, which is also tough, because what if you live in a town that's surrounded by towns that say no? You may not have an opportunity at all to get a micro license. And then there's the conditional licenses for people that may have everything but don't have money. So that's an opportunity as well.
Great. But what about the financial process for getting into the cannabis industry? I mean, it seems to me that there's going to be a certain number of folks that think this is a new industry and they're just going to step into it. And I think many of them don't realize the costs associated with starting up a business of this nature, everything that is required in terms of knowledge of the plant itself and all that comes with it. So, could we talk a little bit about what the financial process is for getting into the cannabis industry, what the expected cost might be, and the things that folks might have to think about?
Yeah, Tom, I'll take that. That's a good question, and I think we could talk for a long time about this topic, but I think I'll try to get down, the most important areas here, right? So you said, just getting involved in this business. What does it take? So there's a ton of moving parts in this industry. So you need to make sure you align yourself for success before you actually take that first step, right? So cannabis may be a buzzing industry right now. It's real hot in New Jersey. It's the green rush, but it's a serious business. There's a lot of regulation. There's a lot of hurdles. It's not just something that you dabble in. It's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of capital. It's going to take a lot of determination. And I just want to mention that you want to stay in your swimming lane, right? You want to know what you're doing to be successful. In New Jersey, they awarded 6 licenses, as Fruquan said: cultivation, processing, wholesale, distribution, retail, delivery. If you have retail experience, maybe you want to open up a dispensary. If you have cultivation experience, you may want to open up a grow house or a farm. With the license you're seeking, it's going to define your business strategy, that's for sure.
And
I was going to capital as well. If you're thinking about raising capital now on the finance side, how are you going to fund your business? Are you going to take in outside investors? Are you going to fund the business yourself? The problem here is banks aren't giving out loans. You can't get an SBA loan from the like the mom and pop bakery. Banks are not touching cannabis, so that's off the table. So what do we do now? I mean, there are investors that are looking to get into the space, but you need to do your research. You need to use cannabis business directories, industry events. You need to network online. Even use crowdfunding, Tom. I mean, it might sound silly, but crowdfunding is a way to fund your business. And lastly, I would just want to mention this: you need to build a team. Okay, so when you're thinking about building that business, making that business work, you might have the best growers in the state. You might have the best product that gets you feeling like Cheech and Chong. You know what I mean? That's all great, but you need administrative staff. You need bookkeepers. You need attorneys. You need CPAs. These are the people that you need to surround your business with. So are you thinking about sales tax, Tom? Are you thinking about income tax, shareholder disputes? These are all things that a lot of the people who get into this industry aren't thinking about until it actually happens. So you basically just want to align yourself in that aspect and keep your finances intact, or else it's going to be an uphill battle.
And let me ask this. I mean, it seems to me that given the nature of the way everything has unfolded, and with folks not even necessarily knowing at this juncture which municipalities might be receptive to having a cannabis client and which would not, means that at a certain point in time, they're probably going to be taking over a building of some sort that's virtually empty. So can you talk a little bit about the costs associated with, what sort of costs one might expect in terms of build out of an empty shell of a building?
Is that an open question, or are you asking me?
You can take it, anyone.
So the cost involved. So it really depends on what business you're trying to get into, right? Mm-hmm. If you're a cultivator, you're going to have to think about lighting, right? You're going to have to think about refrigeration. You're going to have to think about just infrastructure in general to grow those plants. But if you're a dispensary, you have to think about designing your dispensary, making those storage bins look nice. So there's a lot that gets involved, and I believe later on we're going to talk about taxes. I'm going to let you know how that applies to the bottom line, how you can deduct those costs.
Right. Yeah, and I think the point I'm just in general terms is there's potentially a lot of cost here. This isn't something that you can just jump into, especially on the cultivation end. You've got to deal with things such as the humidity levels within the building. The lights themselves kick off a heck of a lot of heat. You're going to need air conditioning in place, and then you've got all of the irrigation costs, the irrigation techniques that are going to be in place. I can't imagine anyone walking around with a watering can every day, depending on the size of the facility anyway. So the point being, there's just a lot of costs that people need to give consideration to. Sean, can you touch upon what it means in terms of being a cash business within the cannabis industry?
Sure, Tom. Yeah, being a cash business, it's one of the most fascinating parts about this industry. I mean, you hear people say cash is king, and it is, but it isn't at the same time in the industry. So just to throw some numbers out, I think there's about 10,000 local and large scale banks, credit unions currently in the United States. 700 of those banks and credit unions actually accept cannabis customers. So less than 1 out of every 10 are willing to work with the cannabis customer. So right off the bat, you have some challenges. In addition, right? So banks are not getting into this. The vast majority of banks are working under federal banking laws, which there's in recent years there's been positions by the federal government to refrain from pursuing action against banks for engaging in banking cannabis, but the law still officially prohibits that. So it's a large consideration having that banking relationship. In addition to that, there are some positives, right? There's no merchant processing fees. From my financial statement view, assessing receivables, and there's no bad debt expense, there's no credit risk, as you're primarily a cash business. But it creates a perception also being a cash business. So more ideological when someone thinks of a cash business, or at least when I think of a cash business, I think of tax evasion, I think of money laundering, I picture armed security guards, and all things that create a stigma for the industry that's unfair. So unfortunately, until federal law changes that, anyone in the cannabis industry, from a cultivator to a dispensary, is going to be facing those same stigmas, being a cash business. In addition to that, there's anti-money laundering that creates an administrative burden. There's cost, there's effort involved with that. And I believe we have an article coming out in the next week that covers more details about anti-money laundering, banking, and merchant processing. But we've had many discussions with merchant processors in recent years regarding their position with working in the cannabis industry. And currently, none of them are working in the industry. It's just too high risk. So there, a cannabis at the dispensary level, your customer base is not going to be able to purchase on a credit card. So it's a significant limitation. And finally, we've been talking to people who have been in the cannabis industry for years, and while years ago it was the case where there was a lot less banks, and people who were operating in the cannabis industry needed to be creative, pack their car full of cash and cross state lines to find that bank that was willing to accept their deposits. That's fortunately not the case in today's world. So the industry has come a long way, but it still has a long way to go.
Sean, can I ask you a question? Do you think the government's going to step in? Because if anyone suffers, it's the taxes, right? The people aren't paying taxes. If it's too much cash, that's the problem. So you think the government will step in at some point?
I think they will. There's a bill that's passed the House, the SAFE Act, that's going to relax some of the rules surrounding cannabis companies' ability to access the financial banking system. There's been a lot of speculation that could be one of the first laws to go through the Senate, but I'm hopeful that's the case, because right now it creates a significant burden.
Yeah.
And associated with that, then, if you've got a large amount of cash on hand, then obviously you're going to have the cost of securing that cash. So there's going to need to be, as part of the plan that would be submitted to the state, is security. And I don't know, Fruquan, do you want to talk a little bit about the point system at all, or anyone want to talk about the point system at all?
I mean, yeah, like Sean was saying, I think the cash is a problem. Close that loop. I remember watching an episode of Breaking Bad, and I probably only watched 2 episodes through the whole series. Everyone tells me it's great, but I didn't watch. So I'm watching this one episode, and they get into the storage locker, and the storage locker is filled with cash, like piled up about the size of a Volkswagen, right? So he walks in there, and the lady says, "I have no idea how much it is." And he says, "Why don't you know?" He said, "Well, I tried to weigh it, but that doesn't work because it's all different denominations. Then I tried to count it, and I spent all night and got through only a little bit of it. So I have no idea how much it is. We're never going to be able to spend it." And I think that's where we're headed unless banks step in and try to solve this situation. And we don't want to attract people into the industry that like that. You know, you kind of want people that want to put money in the bank. They want to pay their taxes. They want to. So I'm very hopeful that that will change as more cannabis states make it legal across the country.
And the municipalities that accept those clients are going to want to make sure that everything is being reported to for their own benefit, obviously.
100%.
Right, right. Dan, could you talk about whether Black and brown people will get greater consideration for a license in New Jersey?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't, that word consideration is thrown around interchangeably, and I think it's, to be quite frank, inappropriate. There's no extra consideration for being Black or brown New Jersey when it comes to licensing. There are, however, goals that are put forth in the legislation in terms of trying to get more involvement in the community, such as 30% of all licenses are set aside for minority, women, and disabled veterans. 25% of all licenses are set around for impact zones. Impact zones were selected in the language within the bill by the areas that were most adversely affected by outdated marijuana laws. So in terms of if there's any exact consideration for an application, the answer would be there's not consideration, but there are goals that the state would like to achieve by seeing diverse application status through the commission and through the awards. But there's no point system in if you're Black or brown and applying, you'll get additional points, but there are set goals that are put forth in the legislation.
And the areas that you're talking, I mean, what does this law mean for the inner cities? Has there been any talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. There's really 4 pieces of legislation that I would bring up when you talk about, this failed war on drugs and what do we want to do for social reform and criminal reform just through the lens of marijuana and cannabis. So the first one I would talk about is the expungement bill that was passed in December of 2019 that allows you to now expunge marijuana convictions from your record. Obviously, through the legalization and allowing people with prior convictions to apply for a license and not excluding them from this new industry, I think is a major step. The other 2 bills is the decriminalization bill sponsored by someone with Wimberley, and the one that addresses minors that are using cannabis that may not be of age yet. So what they have done is have called for 1, pending marijuana charges to be dismissed, for this not to apply for any type of housing application that you're on, any type of employment that you're trying to seek.
Did we just lose Dan?
Sounds like he dropped off.
Okay. All right, so let's switch gears a little bit then, and we'll circle back around to Dan when he comes back on. Fruquan,
Yes, sir.
can you address what you expect to see in context of land use and zoning, including what municipalities are doing right now?
Well, as we mentioned, there are 6 types of licenses: cultivation, manufacturing, distribution, wholesale, delivery, and retail. Now, in order to get any of these types of licenses, you need approval from the municipality. Municipalities have the option to say yes to all, to say no to all, or as I encourage, to be more specific and to exercise precision in what you want. So you might have a municipality that says that we want no more than 2 dispensaries, 1 cultivation, 1 distribution, because it really is all separate, right? So I've been meeting with municipalities since November. Despite my consistent urgings early on, towns were like, no, we're going to wait and see what happens if the bill actually passes or not. But now that that's happened, in earnest, I'm probably talking to mayors and city councils 2 or 3 times a week. And what they want to know is, how they're going to limit, what they're going to allow, what they're not going to allow, where they're going to allow it. Because if you're having a conversation about, let's say, a distribution club, who's going to say no to that? It's not impactful at all. And you probably won't know what's going on there if you don't know what's going on there. So that's like an easy thing to get municipalities to say, we don't mind distribution, we don't mind a cultivation, that sort of thing. The retail is a harder sell because some towns are concerned about traffic, and they're certainly concerned about consumption areas as well. Like the idea that people will come there, they'll get high and then have to figure out a way to get home, So that's controversial and difficult for some towns to say yes to. But I think what's happening now, towns are educating themselves. And what I'm expecting to see almost daily is towns coming out with ordinances, letting people know where they will allow cannabis, or if they won't, why not, sort of thing. And I actually like that better than in the previous rounds. Now, when we wrote the bill, and Dan and I worked very hard on it, the idea was for towns to step up and pass ordinances and let people know what you want, what you don't want, where you want it. That didn't happen in the previous round. So what you had was individual applicants having to go to individual mayors and get approval. You can imagine how that turns out. So people that had hired people like Dan Smith or other lobbyists could get a meeting, but if you didn't know anyone, you couldn't even get a meeting to get an approval, and that wasn't at all we were expecting. Hopefully things will be different now, and we'll actually start seeing ordinances from town.
Good. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ryan.
Is that something that gets voted on at the town council, or that the mayor votes on? How is that decided? I mean, is it a vote, or is it decided by 1 or 2 of the councilmen in each particular town? How does that work?
It should be voted on, but what the bill actually says is approval from the municipality. And that actually went to court what that means, right? So if there was an ordinance that was passed by the mayor and voted on by the council, you automatically win, right? That's the grand slam. But if that didn't happen, you could get a letter from the mayor saying, I met Ryan Brandt and his clients, and I know what they're trying to do at this location, and I'm fine with it.
Right.
The state wasn't going to say that wasn't enough. So, I'm hoping to see more ordinances, but the actual law says approval from the town governing body.
Okay.
What that means is,
subjective.
Yeah, but it should be a law. Like, it should be an ordinance. Some towns came right out. Like Newark had an ordinance right away. And they said, these are the facilities we will allow. We will allow retail in this section of town and that section of town. We will allow cultivation in this section of the town and that section of town. So there was no need to have to get a meeting with the mayor and hire somebody for 15 grand and get you a meeting. There was no need to do that. But more towns didn't do it than did. So.
Interesting. Okay. Ryan, you mentioned earlier about the deductibility of expenses relating to cannabis businesses. Can you touch upon that in a little bit more detail, please?
Yeah, so deductibility for tax purposes. So if you're going to be doing your tax return for these cannabis businesses, you're going to be subject to 280E. If you're a plant touching company, this is going to apply to you. So what Section 280E is, very short tax provision in the tax code that says if you're dealing with a Schedule I drug that's on the list of substances, according to the Controlled Substance Act, if you're dealing with a Schedule I drug, you're considered trafficking. okay? And if you're considered trafficking, you're not allowed to take ordinary business expenses as a deduction on your tax return. So what does that mean? So generally speaking, cannabis touching companies are not allowed to take ordinary expenses. They're only allowed to take cost of goods sold. So that takes a lot off the table, right? So if you operate a marijuana dispensary, let's put that into perspective, Section 280E is going to be a problem for you, okay, Tom? You can only write off the price of the product and the packaging of that product, period, okay? You're unable to take a deduction for your payroll costs. You can't take a deduction for marketing, rent, office supplies, or even that expensive security that you're required to have in this business. Those are all off the table. They're permanent differences, never to be deducted, and it's unfair, right? Because other businesses operating maybe, let's say a bakery that doesn't have THC in the brownies, they're allowed to take those deductions. But just because you have that THC means those deductions are now off the table. So let's put it in perspective with a cultivator, a farmer. They're a little bit better off because what cost of goods sold is the deductibility of the expenses. Cultivators have more cost of goods sold than a dispensary. So think about what a cultivator has in cost of goods sold. They have farming, the farmer's labor, they have water, they have soil, they have warehouse, grow equipment, all this stuff that we talked about before, grow lights, refrigeration, filtration systems. This all gets put into the plant as cost of goods sold. So they have an opportunity, cultivators have an opportunity to take more deductions than a dispensary. And Rachel, if you have that PowerPoint slide, I have a really quick example of just a dispensary and how they're affected by Section 280E. This will give you a good insight to how this law really does affect. Okay, so it's up here. So on the left, we have Bob's Bakery, Fruit Quan. Can you see this?
Yes, sir.
Example here. On the left, we have Bob's Bakery. On the right, we have Mary Jane's Edibles. The only difference is there's THC in Mary Jane's Edibles. There's no THC in Bob's Bakery. So if we look at their gross margin, we're both at 67%. We both have gross income of $1 million. And then we have advertising, we have payroll, we have rent, we have all these below the line deductions. And as you can see, Bob's Bakery taxable income is $725,000 because they're allowed to take those deductions. However, look at Mary Jane's Edibles. Their taxable income is now $1 million because they're not able to take some of those deductions into consideration. So just because there's a THC content in Mary Jane's Edibles, she's actually paying $57,000 more in taxes just because there's a different ingredient. Same business, different ingredients, more taxes for the cannabis company. That's in a nutshell what Section 280E is. And this is a visual example, but this is how it's done in the industry. This is tax compliance for cannabis companies.
And now, Ryan, this is at the federal and the state level that these expenses are not allowed to be deducted. Is that correct?
Correct. It starts at the federal level. That's where they implement 280E. And then when we go to the state level, let's talk about New Jersey. They're going to follow federal statute. That's their starting point. And at this point in time, New Jersey has not decoupled from Section 280E. They're still following it. There are some talks of decoupling from the deductible expenses that are not allowed, but it's still new. It's still new and fresh. So that's in the works. Sean and I have a good pulse on that. Dan on the call also has a good pulse on that. We're looking into it. We're following it closely. But if they do decouple, that's going to be that'll be a big win for cannabis companies here in New Jersey.
And other states have decoupled. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, there's a handful of states that actually have decoupled from Section 280E. So we're hoping that New Jersey follows suit. That might be in a couple of years from now. We don't know. We're following it closely, and fingers crossed. We want to help out cannabis companies. We want to see them thrive here in New Jersey. And taxes, yes, they're burdensome for these companies, but the least we could do is have New Jersey kick in and decouple from federal regulation.
Okay.
And I think if I could just jump in and add to that, I think from a federal perspective, I mean, Mexico just took a huge leap forward with full legalization nationally. So I think that really puts pressure on neighboring nations and countries, you know, of what they're going to do with it. So when you look at a country like the United States of America, where so many states individually are moving towards legalization, from a federal perspective, you know, the pressure is really on. So you talk about what are baby steps that we can take to start opening the door towards a full legalization. Decoupling from 280E and allowing banks to incentivize this is definitely something that I think, you know, the pressure's on federally.
Yeah, and Dan, I think we need to anticipate that in the future, there's accelerated legalization and reform at the federal level. And at this point, you know, we're still operating at a local level right now, right? We're dealing with just state regulation, local municipality regulation, but we need to align. If you're going to be getting involved in this business, you need to align your company with the hopes that, and with anticipation that it's going to be federally legal, you know, maybe within a couple of years down the road. So you need to keep that in mind also when you're starting a business. It's maybe you're operating at the local level. Maybe you could expand internationally, or state by state. You could go interstate. So you need to keep that in mind as well when starting your business.
Absolutely. I mean, it's it's as Fruquan said earlier, you want to start to build your team. You want to start making sure that your consultants, your accountants, you know, your attorney, like your team is set, because while these things seem to be moving at a national level, it is still government, and it moves at not the rate of progression as you know, other entities. So, you know, where you're talking about rules and regs are coming out within 6 months, these things aren't going to happen within 6 months. So you want to start to build your team out now, because in the legal industry in New Jersey, this is happening right now as we speak.
Right. So let me ask this, if I may, and of course I'm getting a telephone call while I'm on a webinar here. I apologize. So let me ask you this, Dan. You know, from the employer's perspective, you know, what are the concerns that they have, and what are we seeing, or what are you seeing the responses to those concerns being? And can you talk a little bit about, you know, how impairment is defined? Let's have that conversation. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So what the employer is charged with, or what they can do, is they're going to work with the Cannabis Regulatory Commission. They're going to work with the Police Training Commission to establish regulations for what's known as a workman impairment expert, right? And workplace impairment expert is going to say, okay, I think, and I'll use myself as an example, I'll throw myself under the bus. I think Dan Smith is too impaired at the office. I think that the use of cannabinoids in his system is affecting what his job is functions are able to do. He's not able to perform the daily duties that are described. So what they're going to do is they would be allowed to drug test you to figure out if that isn't true, an accurate statement. Now, what the bill says is that no employer can take any adverse action, but it does allow you to have, for a alcohol and drug-free workplace, the same way that any employer wouldn't want you to be drunk at work, we wouldn't want you to be high at work. You know, another misconception out there is that they can no longer test for THC. The bill would not prohibit a pre-employment screening, but what the question is would that screening and how that relates to your job function? So what are the daily duties of your job function, and what is the determination for what that impairment can cause? So from the employer perspective, they have to look at it from the lens of, is Dan Smith able to perform the job duties as assigned? From an employee perspective, it's, if I'm not at work and I'm participating in cannabis activities and can come to work and perform my job, then I should be cleared regardless of what those workplace standards are. There are talks in the legislature right now, both on the Senate and Assembly side, of, you know, how do we clear this language up just a little bit to make sure that both the employees are protected, but the employer is not at any type of liability and undue liability, because they're going to have people impaired at work. So right now, I know that the Police Training Commission, the Cannabis Regulatory Commission are working together to try to create those regulatory provisions in the employment apparatus of saying, here's how we're going to treat cannabis. As of right now, though, through the legalization bill, you know, the employer would not be able to take any adverse action through cannabinoids being in your system, unless they're able to prove that through job-related situations, this is causing impairment of your job duties as assigned.
And I would guess then that the human resource departments of companies are going to have to now specifically define what their policies are, correct? I mean, just as they do in many other areas.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know,
And And one of the problems here, Dan, is unlike alcohol, where it you know it dissipates, for lack of a better word, out of the system relatively quickly. Cannabis does not. You know, what do employees? You know, how do you even show that someone is impaired, or you know, will there be potentially gray lines in terms of whether someone was impaired or not? And how is that all going to unfold? Do you think there'll be additional lawsuits as a result of it? What do you think will happen moving forward?
I can't comment to the lawsuits, but what I can comment on is that, you know, through the bill, they've given, you know, through policing, you know, we've have these DREs, which are known as drug recognition experts, to know whether somebody's impaired, and they want to try to give that same training to designated employees in the workplace, and that's going to be called the workplace impairment expert. So in terms of, you know, how are we going to define that? You are right in that with alcohol, if you're above 0.08, there's a scientific definition to say universally we consider this to be driving while impaired. You are above the alcohol limit. There's no scientific scale yet as to say you are high. You know, what they're looking at right now is just different body movements, language, you know, rapid eye movements of determining that. But the commission is charged with trying to determine what is that scientific benchmark going to be throughout the state of New Jersey for, you know, here's how we're going to define impairment from a universal standard. That standard does not exist yet, to be clear, but it is something they are charged with working toward.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
And
and
Fruquan,
I
you look
like
like
the
you're about to say something. Go ahead, Fruquan.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be so different than what's going on now. If you get pulled over and they ask you to say the ABCs without singing it and touch your nose and then walk the line and all that stuff, like I think it's going to be something similar, if not the same as that, because there are a lot of legal substances that can mess you up and impair you. It's not just cannabis, you know, it's all types of drugs you can take, prescription drugs you can take, over-the-counter drugs you can take, lack of sleep. Like it all kind of has the same effect. I think in terms of lawsuits that I would expect to see, I would expect to see lawsuits for someone that was tested over and over again, always negative because they have an infant in the house and they haven't been getting enough sleep, or they're taking some prescription drug that makes them a little woozy or something like that, and they feel discriminated against. That's what I'm expecting to see.
Okay. Okay. All right. Access to capital. Did we discuss that, Sean? Did we discuss access to capital at all?
We definitely touched on it, Tom. I'd like to highlight just a few things that are out there in the realm of accessing capital. So I mean, access to capital is going to be a challenge for this industry like any other. But this industry does have its regulations that make it even more difficult. So, you know, we talked about cash business. We talked about taxes being a challenge in this industry. Access to capital is just one of those other challenges. It's still, even in 2021, it's still the Wild West, with banks not really in the equation. Actually, in 2020, debt emerged as a pretty strong driver in the cannabis industry. So there are private lenders out there that were really driving capital into the cannabis market. In 2021, there's been a reversal of that, and now it's primarily equity. There's equity now in the market, and that's hinged on the fact that 2020 was not a great year for the cannabis industry until the end of the year. You know, there were expectations in 2020 that really weren't met, and investor expectations were, you know, fell shy. The pandemic and everyone seeing that the cannabis industry really flourished during the pandemic in general, you know, it was just a strong indicator to everyone out there that this industry can withstand a pandemic and a recession. So that was positive. And then in November there was the blue wave that had everyone thinking, all right, you know, favorable cannabis legislation is coming on the federal level. It came on the state level. There's more states that are going to be expected to join. So I think valuations for cannabis companies really shot up after that, and equities become a more attractive source of financing as compared to debt. Debt is still out there. Ryan and I have seen some of our clients with debt, but you're also going to be looking at interest rates anywhere from 12 to 18%, and that's just the nature of the industry. So it's not a very budget-friendly means of financing your operation. The equity is primarily coming in from investors, venture capitalists, angel investors. Withum works with a lot of funds, and lately we've seen a significant uptick in the amount of interest that these fund managers have. And there's small funds, $1 to $5 million funds, to large funds, and those funds are actively seeking cannabis targets. One area that's not a means of capital, and it should come as no surprise, is the capital markets. Cannabis, the SEC, the exchanges prohibit plant-touching companies from being publicly listed. That does not mean that investors aren't getting into the capital markets in the ancillary side. So you have biotech companies, R&D companies, a lot of these emerging companies that are really servicing the industry are being targeted by investors, and SPACs, or special purpose acquisition corps, have really developed as a means to get money into those companies and get them into the public market. So that's been something that's driving capital. One area of capital that entrepreneurs and these individuals looking to get into business need to be cautious about is you have convertible debt. So we've seen it in our day-to-day, and with these convertible debt instruments, they look great. There's no principal and interest repayments, but at the end of that term, or at the end of a certain event happening, that convertible debt will turn into a significant stake of equity for that debt holder, which may be significantly unfair to the business owner. So there's predatory lending out there. I don't know if the CRC has any intent to put forth regulations, oversight of predatory lending, specifically in the cannabis space. But over the next few months, I look forward to seeing if that's something that will be out there.
Interesting. Now, Fruquan and Dan, what are you guys seeing in terms of people that are entering or trying to enter the market? Are they coming well prepared with financial backing, or are you seeing a lot of groups of people with different areas of expertise looking to try and make acquaintances that might be able to help each other in the space?
I'll go after you, Fruquan.
I'm seeing both. Like on my wall, I'm looking up, there's a list of my clients, right? The cannabis clients. I actually keep a list and who they are. And it's like a mixed bag. You see a lot of successful business owners that want to transition to the cannabis industry, right? So I have a client that owns 20 funeral homes. So he has plenty of money and he just wants to open up a cultivation. And I have another client that has a bunch of hotels, right? So he's a hotel franchisor. He wants to come into the cannabis business. Then there's this doctor who has a pain management. So there are a lot of people that are successful and other types of businesses that want to come over to cannabis, and they're not looking for money. And then there are other clients that do need investments from outside, and everybody to a man is pretty much looking for equity investments, like willing to give up 40% of their business for the financing. So in that regard, I try to match the financing with the people that have the expertise and try to create a team that way.
Yeah, I'm seeing the same thing. So there's the people with the means and the capital to get into the cannabis industry that may not have the expertise of cannabis products. For instance, somebody may say, I have a bakery, I have a kitchen, I'd love to be a manufacturer, I'd love to be a processor. However, I don't know how to make oil. I don't know how to make cannabis products. Now, on the other side of that, you may have someone that be very familiar, you know, making, you know, pot brownies or what have you, or lotions or creams or topical ointments, that they may be able to find a marriage that works between both of them to say, here's how we can work together. So there's definitely two columns. I mean, some people, you know, they may have the capital means and the cannabis product knowledge, but what I'd like to highlight is that there is an avenue, and Furqan mentioned it earlier, and I'd like to reiterate it, is that if you do not have the capital, you know, certain part of these licenses are called conditional licenses, right? I don't have all the permitting that I need for the land. I don't have the capital to fund everything, but what I do have is I do have the business plan. I do have the expertise. I do have the knowledge of cannabis products. I want to get in the industry, but I just need to find that investor. So that the Cannabis Regulatory Commission does have a keen eye to saying we will create an avenue, and it is written in the legislation for trying to help, you know, that class of people get attainment for a license, which can help to a full license, but it doesn't necessarily have to come with the capital. That's 35% of licenses. So while there needs to be an accessibility to capital for licenses for a majority of them, that's absolutely accurate, but there is an avenue if you don't have the capital to obtain a license as well. So I would just like to point that out, that they kind of tried to bifurcate it through the construction of this legislation of creating an avenue and a point of access that kind of fits everybody's mold.
Right. I would say there's two types of people, right? There are people that have money and don't want to do any work, and there are people that want to do work that don't want to spend their own money. It's like, you could be the same person in this realm. I'm gonna invest my money and I'm not gonna lift a finger. And in this realm, I'm gonna do all the work and I'm not gonna spend a dime of my money. So part of my job is trying to match the two personalities into one deal. And it's been working out pretty good.
Interesting. I see we have a couple of questions here. One is, are there any known banks in New Jersey who expressed a willingness to work with cannabis clients? I don't know that we want to give names of banks specifically, but I believe there are some. Who wants to handle that one?
Yeah, Tom, I'll mention. I won't name names on this call, but there's two small local banks in New Jersey that have the interests and they have the experience. They've been in the industry banking the medical cannabis clients. Mm-hmm. I know there's been talks of other banks that we've been involved in expressing interest getting into it, but I think that's not in the present. That's, you know, probably to come in the future.
And a couple of credit unions also, I would say. A couple credit unions also.
I think a lot of the banks are getting away from the tier one cannabis touching companies, whereas banks are taking in tier two and tier three businesses. You know, those aren't specifically the plant touching businesses. It's more like the ancillary services that go along with helping those companies thrive, like those soil companies and the solar companies. And yeah, they're servicing those the cannabis businesses, but they're not specifically in the business of cannabis. So banks are taking those tier two and tier three entities, just not the tier one at this time.
Sure.
Yeah, and interestingly, I know that Withum was working behind the scenes, if you will, to establish some procedures and protocols for a bank that was considering getting into the cannabis industry in terms of taking on clients within the cannabis industry, because obviously with the amount of cash that's coming in, they don't want to be running afoul of any sort of cash issues that they might face otherwise. So I know that there's been some discussions there. Let's see, what else do we have? Credit unions. Okay, someone put in that. All right. So let me just throw out a real general question. We've got a couple of minutes left. Dan, I'm going to ask you this question. It's general, same question. I'm going to ask Dan first. Where do you see this industry in 5 years in New Jersey?
Industry in 5 years? Well, remember, in right now, everybody can have one license. So each person is available to have one license, you know, per person. within 2 years, as written in the legislation, you can obtain another license if it's of a different class. So, for instance, if I'm a cultivator and I want a dispensary license, I'm now able to go into a different license class to obtain that. So, in 5 years, I think what you're going to see is the existing industries and the cannabis establishments that have been awarded license. I think you're going to start to see them start to grow outward. I think you're going to see marijuana definitely destigmatized from a community standpoint, and I think what you're going to see is just a completely functioning new industry. And just as we look at any retail store, we'll start to look at cannabis the same way.
Fruquan, same question. And do you think it'll be legal at the federal level?
I don't know about that. I think what we'll see is bigger companies buying up smaller companies in 5 years. Like, I've seen a lot of business plans that have 5-year as exit strategy. Now, the state, for the initial 2 years, went a long way to make sure that there are plenty of mom and pop stores, small businesses, minority-owned businesses get into it, so you don't have a situation where there's a Home Depot every time you want to buy a hammer, and you go to CVS every time you want to buy a Tylenol. We try to set up a system so that they have a lot of all the smaller businesses. But I think 5 years, you're going to see a lot of mergers and acquisitions. You're going to see a lot of companies buying up the smaller ones and a lot more vertical licenses being held.
Interesting.
Ryan,
Sean.
I'm thinking that there's going to be at least some sort of bank reform, like the SAFE Act, as Sean mentioned before. I think they're going to try to clean that up federally. I mean, that only helps the federal government because, you know, there's more regulation there. I'm hoping to see some tax reform, if not on a federal platform, then a state platform. At least the state governments will come around and decouple, as I said before. And yeah, I think those two things, there's definitely going to be some reform and they'll loosen the restrictions there. And that's my hopes, right? 5 years from now, I mean, that could definitely be done. There's a lot of chatter about it now. So if we keep pushing, I think it'll definitely hit the ballots and we'll be able to push it through.
Sean.
Yeah, and in 5 years, I see there being a huge change in perception. I think that change happened. It took some time on the West Coast because they were the pioneers, but I think now, you know, in the Northeast with other states about to jump on the bandwagon, I think the perception is going to have a shorter learning curve here, and in 5 years, it you know, it will be very acceptable for cannabis operators and those companies doing business not to have a stigma or not to have a perception attached to it. And then I guess not maybe not 5 years, but you know, sometime thereafter, the globalization is happening. Dan mentioned Mexico. There's other countries that are just, you know, on the same footing as the U.S. and the supply chain is going to change because, you know, it's not going to make sense to grow cannabis in New Jersey when, you know, there's interstate commerce or there's imports and exports. Right. So I think that's going to shake up the supply chain in, you know, 5 to 10 years.
Interesting point. All right. Well, I think that wraps it up for us today. I think I've covered all the questions.
We just got this one question that just came through that before we wrap up,
Sure, go ahead. I didn't see it. What did it say?
What are the rules for consumption and cannabis-related events, and what are the rules around creating foods that contain cannabis? So you would need a Class 2 license to process or manufacture for any cannabis-infused products. But in terms of food-infused cannabis and consumption at events, I mean, you can't have public consumption of cannabis, but if you're eating gummies, I mean, who's to say, you know, no, they're your gummies, you know?
It's up to the event coordinator, right? As long as they're obeying the law, then it's up to whoever's throwing the event, right?
Yeah, as long as they're parameters of the law, I mean, go for it. I mean, we're now dealing with a legal product.
Right. All right. So with that
right,
said, I'd like to thank everybody, Fruquan, Dan, Ryan, Sean. Thanks very much for your time today. I appreciate it. I know you're all busy. Thank you, Rachel, for your assistance in getting this off the ground. I appreciate it. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out to us at our email addresses, and we'll be happy to help you. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks,
All right,
Tom.
thank you.
Thank you.
Be well, everybody.
Bye-bye.